Senator Mary Jane McCallum is a citizen of the Barons Land First Nation in Brochet, Manitoba. She attended the Guy Hill Residential School in the Paw for 11 years. She started her work as a dental assistant in 1973, attained her dental nursing diploma in 1977, her dental therapy diploma in 1979, and her Doctor of Dental Medicine in 1990. She worked as an assistant professor supervising fourth-year dental students, as well as providing dental treatment in Churchill in the first year after graduating. She moved on to provide dental care in all northern nursing stations that had a clinical setup, as well as some of the southern health centers for the majority of the past 28 years. She worked as the regional dental officer from 1996 to 2000 for the province of Manitoba. Senator McCallum has spoken on many occasions to different groups throughout the country about the residential school experience. She was appointed to the Senate of Canada on December 2nd, 2017, where she has continued to advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples. In addition to her work in the Senate chamber, she plays an active role as a member of the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples and the Standing Committee on Energy, the Environment, and Natural Resources. She continues to work with Manitoba communities on issues including the advancement of oral and holistic health, child and family welfare, and environmental concerns. Senator McCallum and her husband Ron Phillips have two daughters, Courtney and Keely Phillips. Mary Jane and her family have also reunited with her son, who she had given up for adoption in 1975. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Senator McCallum to share some words and insights with us today. And she's going to introduce both James Campbell and Anna Millist as we move forward.
Tansi Kitiayak. Hello, elders. Tansi Nimisak. Hello, my older sisters. Tansi Nistisak. Hello, my older brothers. I'm sorry, my sisters. Tansi Nisimisak. Hello, my younger siblings. Tansika Kilo Niwago Maganak. Hello, all my relatives. Ninas Kumau Kichimanitu, Kitom Kaiwanskaya, Kitom Tapagitatamuya, Kitom Tawapatamanski, Iwarstiniki, Kitom Tawa Pamago Utagagi Mamapichik. Thank you, Creator, for giving me the privilege of waking another day, to breathe once again, to see once again the earth and water, and to see you once again. And the reason that there once again is said so often is because we're never guaranteed another day. I wanted to thank Wanaskatan and for all the work that they have done and that I've witnessed in the last few days. And the elders, many of whom I know and have mentored me for 3 years, and for the people who cooked and brought us sustenance, and for all the teachings we have today, this past few days. Throughout my speech, I will pay tribute to the teachings of our people and the leaders and authors who demonstrated such wisdom in a time of great oppression. Two of these that I mentioned today, or three, are George Manuel in the Fourth World, Wabang, Our Tomorrows, by the Indian Tribes of Manitoba, and Embers by Richard Wagamese. These two, I don't know if you've read them, but you should, because if the government had worked on us with this, we wouldn't be here where we are today. That's how wise our leaders were. And I have made a commitment to bring forward books like this, messages I get from elders, the teachings from leaders, from mentors and scholars who have contributed their wisdom to advance our self-determination, and to bring these forward to the Senate floor in my speeches. I believe that's where they were always meant to go. Over the past 2 days, numerous people have told me that they see me as senator as a symbol of hope. I want you to close your eyes and go deep within yourself and picture the reality I've witnessed over the past 2 days. And for some of you that I've known longer, what I've witnessed from you. You represent hope because you speak it and you walk it. You're here today. You fight. You're fearless. Your intentions are positive. You're humble. You're intelligent, focused, witty, and know when to break out into tears or laughter. That's all good medicine. You are more role models for me, and I will carry this weekend to Senate with me to let me know that I'm not alone. And neither are you. Sometimes people need to be told, you are powerful, you're making change, and we love you. Thank you. Kinanas Sumitnao. I had done my speech before I came. And then I listened to the stories that came out in the last 2 days. Very deep, deep stories that came from inside, stories of trauma. And I realized I had to change my speech. And I didn't write it till last night because I needed to hear what you said yesterday. So I started writing at 8 last night, and at 2 o'clock this morning, I thought, no, this is not the one. So I was up till 5 rewriting this. And because I knew that this had to be a tribute to you, because you have all worked so hard that I needed to bring your stories out. You know what I saw? You already have the solutions. You do. And they were on the floor here. They were in the workshops I went to. So what I'm going to do is bring those out to you. But before I start, I wanted to share something with you. I use a lot of different forms of teachings that come from so many places, from people, from books, from puzzles, from dreams. Since there are so many powerful women involved in this movement, I want to share a dream I had when I was a girl of 8 at residential school. I entered residential school at the age of 4 and left at 16. My mom had passed on from thyroid cancer on December 18, 1957, and I was sent to residential school 3 weeks later. In this dream, I'm sitting at the bottom and in the middle of a boat, which is the safest place. And my mom was standing at one end with both arms upraised, and one was holding the paddle. I remember my face in the dream, and even today I can't tell you the expression I had in my face. It was a mixture of wonder, amazement, trying to figure out what she was doing, but there was knowledge that it was for something good, because Mama wouldn't do anything to harm me. I looked around at the landscape, and the sky had fallen and was touching the water, so that there was no horizon. My mother was keeping the sky from falling onto us, and we could still breathe. But there was no fear in this dream. 57 years later, when my daughter had thyroid cancer, we went to the hospital in Saskatoon to register her on the day of surgery. I said to her, "My girl, there's 3 seats over there. Let's go sit there." So we walked over and sat down, and I felt something up here. And I looked up, and there was a painted mural, and it said, "When the sky falls, hold up your hands." I said, "My girl, look, Granny's here." I didn't know there was such a saying. It was the first time, and this was just 2 years ago. I looked up the meaning of, I looked over the meaning, and I got the best interpretation from a painting by Melba Whitcomb 2 years ago. And quote, "It speaks about the legacy of women supporting each other. It invokes the idea of kindred spirits where two meet strength. The lake meeting the sky echoes the depth of women's ability to shore one another up. Not just in times of adversity, but in times of plenty. Two is an army in good times and bad." And close quote. And this, when she did the painting, it had nothing to do with people on a boat. When I commissioned an artist to do the painting in 2017, he drew 2 children in the boat. And I realized that at that moment that as women and creators of life, each generation of women will do what is humanly possible to protect children and others who need them. This is what I've witnessed at this conference. We'll make a good team. All of us in this room. Now let us see what we can do for our children. And that was from Singapore. I worked as a dentist in my home community of Roche for many years. On one of those trips, I had gone out on the land with my family, and we were traveling on Reindeer Lake. I asked my nephew why he didn't get lost in the water system that had thousands of islands. He said, "My dad taught me always look back, to landmark, so you see the islands from both sides, because when you head back, the land and waterway won't look the same." There were various interpretations that I took from this saying. It's all the saying of always look back. One was about the immediate situation of navigating a water system, but on a higher level, it was for us to look back at our history to see where we have come from so we don't get lost. When my daughter wanted a tattoo, she asked me for a teaching, and I took what my nephew Rod Jr. had said about looking back, and I translated as this. Kawidawi gatswanigis iti kagi ukitaskin. Never ever forget where you came from and how you were raised. From the Creator and raised by the land, the water, the teachings, environment, seasons, ecology, astronomy, community, family, kinship, values, tradition, and all our relations. Our people had a PhD in life, and they understood the web of life. Their world had the solutions they needed, and so do we today. We just have to remember all our teachings. So what I'm sharing with you is what I use wherever I go, and I have many teachings. My daughter has that tattoo in syllabics on her back, the back of her neck. In Cree, the word Kakiupi Taskin is a word similar to world or earth, but it's had some much more deeper and complex meaning that takes into account what influenced and shaped us in our ways of knowing life course and destiny. We carry our own unique world within each of us and wherever we go, each of us in this room. When I was sworn in at Senator in December 2017, I said to the people in Brochet, the people at the Pastoral Cree Nation, I said the Mary Jane that walked into the Senate chamber was not the individual Mary Jane, but the collective Mary Jane who had been shaped by the Creator, the land, history of family and kinship, community, elders, teachings, friends, and all the people I have met on this earth journey. Some are in this room today, and thank you. My thoughts, my actions, my words, values, my intent were the culmination of this knowledge that wasn't derived from a textbook. The voice I carry with me into chamber and here today in this sacred space is one that I hope carries with it respect, kindness, and direction that will help to guide my words and actions. I don't want my negative energy or negative spirit to guide my actions, as I don't want it to revisit my children. We all know the saying, what goes around comes around, and that's when we act negatively, our children see it and they model it. So when I'm in Senate, I think of all these teachings and I pray every time I'm going to speak that my ego doesn't overpower my spirit, that it's my spirit talking to your spirit this morning. In the book entitled The Fourth World by George Manuel and Michael Kosman's, George Manuel states, a cornerstone of the mythical structure that has stood in the way of the Indian reality has been a belief that an Indian way of life meant something barbaric and savage, frozen in time and incapable of meeting the test of changing social conditions brought about by new technology. This myth was created, sorry, I was timing myself. This myth was created by confusing the particular forms in use at one time with the beliefs and values and beliefs they help to realize. A man who is wedded to the soil is not necessarily married to a wooden plow. A man of letters is not committed to a fountain pen or a microphone. It is true that there have been a number of surface changes that have increased understanding. Our children now often go to provincial schools rather than church schools, and we are now allowed into most hotels and protected against the most blatant forms of discrimination. While these changes may be important for their own sake, few, if any of them, reach below the surface and touch on the fundamental ways in which two cultures so different in their roots meet and touch each other. Only with that meeting and touching can the gap be closed. Only the closing of the gap, not a domination of one over the other, but a real meeting can result in real change, close quote. Sometimes we need to have difficult conversation within ourselves and amongst ourselves. Sometimes we create our own obstruction to progress. One I'm raising today is the racial-based division of white versus indigenous. Some people feel that white people should have little or no say in a conversation about decolonization or about advocacy for indigenous rights. I have witnessed this for many years of my life. My husband is from an English Scottish background and my children are biracial. This argument has been directed at us many times, but I didn't give this attempt at marginalization any power. We cannot displace children because of their racial mixture. We cannot walk a road of reconciliation by ourselves as indigenous people. We will always be living with others in this multicultural country we call home. Our lives are too bound up with others for either of us to go entirely our separate ways. We will need the support of many Canadians to start making the changes we need to change our world. We need the support of many global leaders to start making changes we need to change the world of resource extraction. And I wanted to thank all the youth that I see, and from all backgrounds. I'm so glad you're here. We need you here. And with that, I wanted to introduce Anna and James. When you're in Senate, there is now 12 Indigenous senators, and there's one parliamentary advisor I know that's Indigenous, and the rest are from different backgrounds. When I went into Senate, I knew that I needed somebody to guide me through the Senate, on the Senate walk that I was taking. And I interviewed James, and I knew that he was the young man that I was meant to walk this journey with. James has been in Parliament for 10 years, although he is a very young man. But he has a lot of experience, and to me, he's an old soul. And Anna, is the executive assistant, and she worked at the House of Commons and in Senate, and she also worked in private with the border security. So they brought with them a lot of skills. So I take them with me whenever I go anywhere, because people need to see who works for you. They need to know, you need to know the passion and the dedication that goes into our speeches, into our advocacy, into when we go into the Senate chamber committee meetings. You need to know who's representing you. And in Senate is not a friendly place all the time, and I need someone to watch my back. I have them, and I watch theirs. So there's a lot of loyalty, and they're going to be speaking so that you get an idea of where, how they work. And James and Anna keep me on the straight and narrow with ethics, because I don't know the rules, and they'll say, Senator, you can't do that, you can't do this. And of course I'm like, no, I want to do that. So it's a good team, and I'm very blessed to have them. Okay, in the last 2 days, I took notes of what you said. And I heard what contributed to ongoing adverse impacts of resource extraction. And these were the ones noted. And when I write them down, it's not by subject. It's up to you to decide, where does this go, where does that go, who's going to handle that, who's going to handle that. But at this time, coming from Senate, we are available to work with you on this. And we have started going to communities, Fox Lake, Opaskwayak Cree Nation. We've gone to the territories and the Yukon. We're going to be going to York Landing and to Split Lake. So it's good to see firsthand, because when I speak about this in Senate, I need the background of the community. So these included the power of various and collective industry, corporations owning the government and having the same rights as a human being, industry-government alliance versus First Nation government alliance, lack of collective voice at all levels and from different institutions, silence, which is the biggest, to me, that's the biggest one, the silence of these adverse impacts, and we need to bring them out, and consistently and for a long time. The consent issue, the unilateral decision-making, the unilateral development, and all those impact our self-determination. Those were what were taken away from Guideville from us. And there's 11 core concepts of self-determination. And we looked at them, I've done speeches on it, and now I'm reclaiming those back. And we need to do that with our youth. We need to teach them what self-determination is and how they get the skills at a young age to develop their critical thinking skills. Turning a blind eye to violence against Indigenous women, girls, and men. And that's another topic that's close to our office. Passiveness, power of capitalism and consumerism, web of life destruction, separating children from culture of water. Being treated like beggars. We're not beggars. Not looking for handouts. When I look at those are the consequences of resource extraction. But they get back into the mix and they become themselves ongoing adverse impacts. It's an intergenerational aspect. And your daughter worded it very, when she said, I don't understand this process. And now it's coming back around. So if we looked at those, and some of this is shame-based, so we need to look at shame and how do we remove that from our communities. Signing confidential agreements, splitting community and families in half, employment at 90% but no change. And this means that economic development without human and community development as a foundation will not work. And we read books on aid to international countries, and this is the same thing happens. They don't develop the community, but they develop infrastructure. So people are left with roads, with airports, but nothing in their community. And it raises hope, and hopeful that this time things will work out, and it doesn't. We live in the toilet bowl of the North. Addiction to fossil fuel with endless consumption of energy. Windigo economy. Preferential contracts under resource sharing. The greed of industry. Why is it so cheap to produce and so expensive to pay, especially for Indigenous people? Privatization. For the youth, development is going too fast and can't keep up. Not educated on process of development, and that needs to change because our leaders are not here. Youth not consulted, and that stepping stones are missing. Leaders not educated, and they say everything has a price. Hydro dams seen as clean energy. Scientific knowledge is questionable, and private investors. And I'm sure many of them don't know what they're doing. So when you look at those, the solutions are there. It's just who is going to handle this. You have a research arm, and now you have a legislative arm. You have the grassroots. I don't know what else there is. I heard many solutions as well. We can't just sit back. We need to work together. And what does that mean? We need to work together in research and to inform public policy. I think that is one of the most important things, that people get involved in public policy so that you influence what happens in Senate, what happens at the House of Commons. Southern parliamentarians lost legislation determining our lives in northern Manitoba. And how do you change that, and how do we give voice? That and Southern politicians have no idea of what they're doing. And we would say that when we're in Senate, those are the unintended and sometimes intended consequences of legislation. And when we realize that, how do we change it? It is possible to stop pipeline projects, and don't let them create the narrative. We need to write our own stories, our stories of hope, the stories that we carry within us. Future needs all of us to work together towards change. Canada needs structural adjustment in energy. In the ugliness that surrounds us, let's do something uplifting. We don't want a predatory energy system. Do a declaration to keep going, doing work. Identify who is extractive. 75% of mining and dams are by Canadian companies here. And how do we bring that out? Activism in difficult socio-political and economic context is a David and Goliath challenge, and how do we help? How do we mobilize? How do we mount opposition at all levels? The dam is already built. How do we oppose it? Demand liberation of rivers. Our fight is not to fight new dams, it is to dismantle. Movement became informed because data presented to support your struggle. Moratorium on further projects. And for one, there was BCR, and due to the violation of peace, they kicked out Shell by using Indigenous law. And this was in Alaska. And I also heard wise words. And what I'm doing here to you is I'm paying you tribute, because you had your stories, but you also had the solutions. And in all that time, you had hope. That's the only way that you have worked so hard for so many years, and you haven't given up hope. I heard wise words, and some are also solutions. Our song is your song, solidarity. Development is such a dirty word. And up to that time, I never realized that development was a dirty word. It is not development, and we need to change the language. They've studied safety of animals, the mice and rodents, but not people. Our highways are rivers and lakes. When a highway in Winnipeg City breaks, it's fixed immediately, but our rivers are purposely contaminated. We need money to survive, but only to a certain point. George Manuel brings this up, and he said, the danger now is that when our children, and this affected me, when they become part of the system, that they may now begin to abuse the system as well. They become trapped in consumerism and greed. And I know it because I've walked it. And I still walk it today. You know, I have an addiction to shopping. So I'm a consumer. And now I've started looking at what is all based. You know, the furniture I have, the whatever, and so I'm starting to make a change in my life as well. We're all on the same boat. Look at what our relatives teach us. Plants like squash, whose seeds lay dormant for years, teaches us about resilience and hope. And when our people had to go underground, because they couldn't practice their ceremony, they went underground, and they remained there, and they came out. They were the seed, it was dormant as a seed. And now we've picked up that bundle again, and we're carrying on. Be prayerful, we are spirit. And it really helps me to be respectful when I think of myself as a spirit and everyone in the room. And I do that in Senate as well. Restore peace without violence. Indigenous peoples across the world are brothers and sisters. The land can heal again. How do we do that? I'm afraid to no longer feel. Fear brings up different choices. It increases risk. So we shouldn't act out of fear. We have nothing to fear. We have done nothing wrong. Nothing. And how do we mount opposition? And how do we mount against capitalism? Fish have water memory. And with slow violence, nobody cares. It's about others, but we need insight into ourselves for spiritual growth. And so I wanted to leave that with you. I've run over a bit of my time. I have done a section on the history of capitalism and how it progressed in Canada and how it left us out. And I'll just quote Frances Widdowson. She said, despite the serious nature and pervasiveness of Aboriginal dependency, the subject has not been an area studied extensively in Canadian political economy. Instead, most of the analysis of Aboriginal marginalization and deprivation has occurred outside the discipline, where the expropriation of Aboriginal lands by European settlers and the destruction of native traditions by the Canadian state are advanced as the dominant explanations. The focus is on the racist attitudes of non-Aboriginals, rather than examining how the historical requirements of capitalism have influenced the current circumstances of Aboriginal peoples. And that's what I had read. And it is such a huge topic. I thought, how could you ever bring this? But that is a topic that we really need to research. And she goes further to ask, why did Aboriginal peoples become marginalized after the fur trade, while the rest of the country developed? And the impression is created that poverty will disappear with better opportunities, thus ignoring structural problems and the fundamental change required to a system that oppresses. So when we looked at some of the communities that had come and were into economic development and they were doing well, they were giving the money to their people, actually the suicide in those communities increased. Because there was no human development. It was just, there was nothing there for, it was the status quo. And we need to develop the skills of our children, their spirituality. They need to know that we were not put on this earth for nothing. And groups like Waniskatan, it means let's wake up, have been advocating and bringing to light the atrocities created and administered by various industries in Canada. They have been doing the job that the government, like the Office of the Auditor General, was meant to do. It needs an oversight body, so James and I looked into that. People who have been marginalized, oppressed, abused, dispossessed aren't born. They're made by different levels of authority, including provincial and federal governments. Part of the problem has been that the government feels they can and may ignore the pleas from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples when there seems to be little to no oversight body. Secrecy continues to contribute to the lack of accountability of Canada to the human rights abuses of Aboriginal peoples. Secrecy allows people to turn a blind eye. We need a mechanism that will bring to light the contribution of industries and the provincial and federal leaders to the dire situation that Mother Earth is in. Thank you.
Such a warm welcome and ovation. Good morning, everyone. My name is James Campbell, and as you heard, I'm the Director of Parliamentary Affairs who works with Senator McCallum in Ottawa. I'd like to start by recognizing that we are gathered here on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and also on the homeland of Métis Nation. I want to extend my deep thanks to Kelly, Ramona, and everyone whose tireless efforts and hard work has made this conference possible. It has been extremely valuable and enlightening for me so far, and that's a pretty big understatement. On that note, I'd also like to thank all of those here today and those who have been in attendance throughout the conference. I've had the chance to hear many of your insights and teachings, and I can assure you that they will be valuable to all of us as we continue to fight to protect our lands and resources from further devastation at the hands of industry and government policy. We're in a pretty unique position to be able to fight that battle from the inside. So we've started it, and we're going to be continuing to do it. I remain humbled to be gathered with such passionate troublemakers, which was coined the first day, and as the conference has progressed, I can only see that that's proven to be very true. Now, I first feel that it is important to explain how our interest and involvement in this issue came about. As part of her duties in the Senate, Senator McCallum serves as a member of the Standing Senate Committee on Energy, the Environment, and Natural Resources. For the better part of this past year, this committee had been studying a bill known as the Impact Assessment Act. This bill enables many transformative changes to how future resource development projects will proceed. Specifically, the bill aimed to ensure that only responsible projects with a responsible plan of action would be able to proceed. Additionally, and importantly, the bill further enshrined into law the onus of both companies and the Crown to adequately consult with impacted and surrounding Indigenous groups to ensure that their views, knowledge, and insights are incorporated into the planning and execution of these projects. This bill, which has since passed and become law within Canada, aimed to effect positive change in environmental protections. However, a major concern that we had throughout the process was how loudly industry was heard during consultations on this bill compared to how muted the voice was in support of the environment. Since its introduction in Parliament, this bill had and still continues to this day to cause great uproar and great division within Canada, largely along regional lines. This is due to the fact that many who are pro-industry are located within the heart of the prairies, where the oil sands and many other developmental projects are located. It has recently come to light, very troubling for us, that 80% of all of the lobbyists who came to Senate on this bill represented industry. 80%. On the other hand, only 13% represented environmental groups, and only 4% represented Indigenous interests. And that 4% was the same First Nation who slogged from office to office. So that's pretty sad. Although Senator McCallum had fought to have greater equity and balance in who we heard from and who we visited during these testimonies, those attempts within the Senate were fruitless and fell on deaf ears. While the Senator has always been aware of the impacts of resource extraction and development due to her many years working in rural and northern communities here in Manitoba, the picture became much more clear and much more bleak during the process of studying this bill. In the hopes of giving credence to what we had heard during the study, we had put forward a number of amendments to this bill that looked to support what we had heard from those whose voices have been minimized during this discussion. Specifically, Senator McCallum put forward a number of amendments to the bill, which included an amendment that would see a non-abrogation or derogation clause that reaffirms both the duty to consult as well as Indigenous rights as granted by Section 35 of the Constitution, an amendment that would give special recognition to the impact that various aspects of resource extraction and development have on women, and especially Indigenous women, an amendment to ensure that the decision-making mechanisms in this bill would take into consideration the Canadian government's commitment to upholding and implementing the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Another amendment that would give assurance that there would be a just transition to a low-carbon and clean economy, and that during this transition, good and decent jobs would be available for people, and especially Indigenous people. An amendment that indicated that Indigenous knowledge, especially that of Indigenous women, would be considered at least equal to scientific knowledge during the impact assessment of future projects. An amendment that requires a gender-based analysis to be undertaken on the effects of policies, plans, programs, and issues that were to be assessed. And finally, an amendment that agreements and arrangements which were previously made, previously in force between Indigenous governments and the federal government be respected and upheld when it comes to resource sharing and related oversights. As you can see, we worked pretty hard on this bill to ensure that the voices of those who were not heard through testimony were heard through these amendments. Unfortunately, not all of these amendments passed into law, but a great number of them did, which was a very big victory because it was a very big uphill battle. This represented to us a very important first step because these ideas and notions were foreign when it comes to the floor of Parliament, especially the floor of the Senate. While these amendments we know may not be and may not represent everything, it is an important step in making this subject matter, which is uncomfortable for many of the other senators here in Canada, both familiar and comfortable moving forward. As we have heard before, it is time for the government to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Now, once this legislation had passed into law, we found it was impossible to move on and to simply forget the stories of those that we had heard who have literally had their lives and their communities devastated by resource extraction and development. Many of those people sit in this room today. Knowing that we had to do more, Senator McCallum wrote a letter this past spring to the Office of the Auditor General here in Canada. A lot of people think the Auditor General is a financial body, but it also audits policies and programs at the federal level to make sure that those policies and programs are operating efficiently, effectively, and are doing what they're supposed to do. Through this letter, we had requested that a special investigation be undertaken by the Auditor General's office to examine the cumulative negative impacts of resource extraction and development within Canada. A lot of what's been done before has been a very siloed approach. It's looked at one thing, and it's looked at one thing very half-heartedly. So what we want and what we need is the full picture of what's going on and exactly why and how these communities are facing what they're facing today. We were well aware that this request and this subject matter are both extremely ambitious and extremely frightening to the people who we confronted about it. As I've said, many here are far too familiar with the breadth and scope that resource extraction and development has on surrounding communities. Without getting into the nitty-gritty, there are issues of land, water, and air degradation. There are health concerns from the toxins that inevitably make their way into our ecosystems. There are sustenance concerns as the surrounding flora and fauna are either killed off or forced to relocate. There are safety concerns due to an influx of workers and the creation of so-called man camps. These man camps tend to bring with them a toxic masculinity that results in violence, sexual assault, prostitution, sex trafficking, alcohol and drug addiction, and blatant racism and sexism, both from the workers and from the company policies. I know I don't need to be saying this because a lot of you here deal with this in your lives on a daily basis. On a personal note, I have recently had the opportunity myself to see all of these issues firsthand. Just last month, the community of Fox Lake here in Manitoba welcomed the Senator and I into their community and onto their land to see the devastation, both the devastation to the people as well as to the land and its resources. This devastation has been wrought, as many of you know, by the 4 major hydro dams in their area. Kettle Dam, Long Spruce Dam, and Limestone Dam were all built in the 1960s or 70s, and the infamous Kiosk Dam that we've heard from so far this conference started construction about a decade ago, still remains a work in progress. These dams, and again, this is going to be familiar to pretty much all of you, I'm sure. These dams resulted in the flooding of traditional lands and burial sites. Many trap lines have either been leveled or flooded out. Animals like moose and caribou, which were once in abundance, are now nowhere to be seen, scared away decades ago from all of the blasting and yet to return. These dams even completely reverse the flow of a river. Again, these dams reverse the flow of a river. I don't think that I want to know what ungodly actions need to be taken to forcefully overpower Mother Nature in that way. And if anything, well, there might be economic benefit that comes with that. It comes from the proximity. I can tell you the answer is largely a resounding no. Instead, Fox Lake, a community devastated so that hydropower can be produced, pays an average of $800 a month for hydro in the winter months. While I was humbled to have the opportunity to hear the story of Fox Lake and see firsthand what they were dealing with, I can assure you it has further ignited our passion and resolve to right these wrongs and to ensure these injustices do not continue. However, we recognize that we needed the help of outside entities to be able to fight this battle effectively, as most of these issues are cross-jurisdictional. The problem lies both within the province as well as the federal government. If we were to continue down this path alone, without the help of these outside entities, we could, at the very best, only achieve half of the work required, as we would be unable to get into the meat of the provincial jurisdiction from our perch in federal politics. We were able last week to meet with the Auditor General's people, where we learned that they face similar constraints, only being able to review federal policies and programs. As such, we now know the next step we have ahead of us on our path is to contact all of the Provincial Auditors General to seek their assistance and their compliance in working with federal counterparts on this investigation. It has been done before, and we will work to ensure that that cooperation happens again. These provincial entities have the ability to review their province's environmental policies and procedures to ensure that they are complying with their intended purposes. It is our goal that with these two bodies working together, we will finally be able to have a complete review on the cumulative adverse impacts of resource extraction here in Canada. The goal is, once we're armed with this information, we will be able to see what gaps exist in current policies, which policies are in place that are simply inadequate and thus failing our communities. With this vital information, we will be better prepared to target these shortcomings and to fill these gaps and inequities to ensure our citizens, our land, our water, and our air remains protected and remains healthy. One more point I would like to expand upon, and which I had mentioned very briefly, is the profound impact that resource extraction and development has on women, and especially Indigenous women. Not only are Indigenous women more likely to face discrimination, sexual violence, they are least likely to benefit from any potential opportunities that may arise in these development projects. This much has become overly clear to us. As such, we are intending to put forward a bill in Parliament which would give greater consideration to the impact on women of all future legislation, as well as advance women's rights here in Canada. Through this bill, we would call on the laws of Canada to be in harmony with the principles set out in the Beijing Declaration. And this declaration is a UN document that moves the agenda forward on gender equality. This bill would, in short, advance the empowerment of women as equal decision makers and agents of change in economic, social, and political processes, and focus on achieving equitable and sustainable progress, improving women's status, and respecting women's rights and contributions. I will leave the notion of women's issues and gender-based analysis to my colleague Anna Millis, who will discuss this more in depth. I would like to leave off with two final thoughts. The first is to draw from a notion put forward by Dr. Derek Cornelison in a breakout session yesterday afternoon. Dr. Cornelson's presentation was in part entitled Learning to Learn from Indigenous Resurgence. That was something that resonated with me. I am not and will never stand before you and tell you what is best. Instead, I stand before you with the intent to learn from you, to take what we have heard and to bring your voices to the floor of Parliament. Our intent is not to fight for you. Our intent is to make space for you to be able to fight for yourselves. Finally, I would like to agree with the point Dr. Joshi raised yesterday morning. She had said this is a David and Goliath type battle. I agree. However, it's gatherings like this that bring a lot of little Davids together, and when that happens, Hydro better be careful. One David beat Goliath. One David beat Goliath. A band of Davids united can change the world. Waniskatan, let it be said that I am prepared to rise up with you. Thank you all again for your time and contributions this weekend. It has been transformative for me.
Good morning. As you've been told several times this morning, my name is Anna Millist, and I work with Senator McCallum in Ottawa as her executive assistant. I would like to give my heartfelt thanks to Senator McCallum for inviting me to attend this conference alongside her and honoring me with the opportunity to speak. I would also like to give thanks to the speakers and panelists for sharing their insight, to the elders for sharing their wisdom, and to the organizers for their very, very hard work in bringing us together from across the globe. It has been a valuable learning experience to listen to all the presentations over the past few days and engage in thought-provoking discussions. I have been very moved by the personal accounts and stories of the many, many people here living with the horrific effects of hydro development. Although these conversations can be difficult to have, it is so important that we are here together having them. Yesterday afternoon, I attended the breakout session, Our Voices Together in Trauma and Resilience, sharing stories of gendered violence of resource development. I was so impressed by the presenters, Louisa Constant, Martina Saunders, Hilda Anderson-Pierce, Connie Gray Eyes, and Jackie Hansen. What they shared about the gendered impacts of hydro and resource development was heart-wrenching, yet they tackled it with courage, resilience, and a forward-facing outlook. I wish that this group had presented on this stage before the whole conference, as the gendered impacts of hydro development are an integral piece that is important for everyone to hear. And although I'm sure, as I've mentioned, there are others here who are better equipped to speak on this topic, I will be speaking today on the topic of gender-based analysis, what it is, how it can be applied to hydro energy and natural resource development projects. Gender-based analysis, and particularly Indigenous gender-based analysis, is an area that I've been studying and performing literature review on with encouragement from Senator McCallum, as this is a topic that carries great importance and is applicable to just about every issue that comes before Parliament and through our office. As so many of the stories we've heard have shown, resource development and extraction activities are having significant adverse effects on northern and remote communities in relation to employment, housing, education and training, health, social services and infrastructure, substance abuse, sex work and exploitation, violence, food security, and culture and traditions. These impacts disproportionately affect women, especially Indigenous women and those from marginalized groups. As we've heard many times over, for people in hydro-impacted communities, employment is scarce. The few positions that are available to locals are low-skilled, short-term, lower-paying, shift-based, and are subject to boom and bust cycles. Work sites are usually male-dominated and are rife with sexism, racism, and harassment. The influx of outside workers puts a strain on housing, both availability, living conditions, and costs. The most vulnerable segments of the population, those with health issues, disabilities, mental health conditions, addictions, and the elderly, are the ones who are most strongly affected by these changes, and existing health conditions are exacerbated. When it comes to health, there are both direct and indirect effects with resource development. Sources of water are compromised, causing widespread health risks within the community. Biologically, women and children are more vulnerable to these effects given the cycles of pregnancy and breastfeeding. Mental health effects of resource development are significant, with sky-high rates of stress, depression, and addiction. Social services is another area where the sheer volume of outside workers put a strain on communities. Professional services such as healthcare can become overburdened. Additionally, the financial lure can incentivize service providers to take higher-paying jobs in the private sector at project sites, leaving vacancies in community services. In many cases, this gives people no other option but to rely on family for support, and is particularly notable in the area of childcare, where female relatives, grandmothers, aunts, sisters, etc., are the ones to pick up the slack. Alcohol, drugs, and addiction tend to follow development projects. Youth are especially vulnerable, and alcohol and drug use tends to increase. Substance abuse also feeds into domestic abuse, putting women at higher risk for victimization. Sexual exploitation and human trafficking are also a major problem in areas of resource development. Although women in general are at risk, those most likely to be exploited are Indigenous women, women who are homeless, struggling with mental health issues or addictions, or living in poverty. Resource development projects are often associated with an increase in crime, particularly gender-based and domestic violence. Transient workers who are outsiders do not respect the community and its members, behaving in ways they would never behave in their own communities. Resource extraction affects access to food in many ways. Projects drive up the cost of food through increased demand, making it unattainable for those with lower incomes. Since women typically earn lower wages than men, they're at a higher risk for food insecurity. Not only does development affect access to food for purchase, it affects local and traditional sources of food. Toxins are leached into land and water, making traditional sources of food and water unsafe to consume. This in turn impacts both the health and culture of Indigenous peoples, women, and communities. Given the interconnectedness of Indigenous culture and land, resource development has devastating effects on culture and traditions. Projects disrupt or block access to traditional land, including hunting grounds, trap lines, sacred sites, and gathering sites. Without access to these places, the ability to engage in cultural activities and pass them along to the next generation is stunted. So, it raises the big question, how do we move forward in a way that will diminish these adverse effects and maximize the long-term benefits? There are several processes that currently exist as tools to identify, assess, and mitigate the impacts that resource development projects have on the lands and surrounding communities. The main processes that exist here in Canada are environmental assessment and gender-based analysis. The interest in environmental assessment processes for resource development began in the early 1970s, prompted by growing public awareness and concern about environmental issues and the need to protect the planet. Over time, the type of impacts included under the environmental framework were expanded to include socioeconomical effects in addition to the original focus of pollution and physical degradation of the environment. Although the environmental assessment process now takes a broader view of impacts, there's still a tendency for assessments to focus on tangible, direct environmental effects rather than social impacts, cultural impacts, and indirect impacts. Gender-based analysis is a slightly newer process, having been formally introduced by the federal government in 1995, though the Government of Canada began making commitments to consider women's issues when making policy decisions in the 1970s. In 1995, Canada adopted the UN's Beijing Platform for Action, as James mentioned, which required that all member states develop a concept for the implementation of gender mainstreaming as part of their national strategies and, quote, seek to ensure that before policy decisions are taken, an analysis of their impact on women and men, respectively, is carried out. Following this, Canada developed the Federal Plan for Gender Equality, which committed to conducting gender-based analysis on all future legislation, policies, and programs. In 2009, the Auditor General was asked by the Standing Committee on the Status of Women to investigate the gender-based analysis practices of government departments and agencies. In the report, it was revealed that there was little or no evidence that GBA frameworks in practice or in decision-making. In 2011, Status of Women Canada rebranded GBA to GBA Plus to include other gender diversities and intersectional identity factors. following yet another Auditor General's report in 2015 that indicated the need to do more to fully implement GBA as a rigorous practice across government. The federal government developed the GBA Action Plan 2016 to 2020, including mandatory requirements for GBA Plus in all memoranda to Cabinet and in Treasury Board submissions. According to Status of Women Canada, GBA Plus is defined as an analytical tool used to assess the potential impact of policies, programs, initiatives, or services on diverse groups of women and men, girls and boys, taking into account gender and other factors such as age, education, language, geography, culture, and income. GBA Plus is a lens through which any policy, program, initiative, service, or project may be assessed to ask the question, does an aspect of the proposed policy, program, initiative, or service have the potential to impact women and men differently? And if so, how? As such, GBA Plus can be a valuable tool to use in ensuring that gender and diversity are taken into account through impact assessments for resource development projects. As it stands, Canada-wide, GBA is required for all federal policies, programs, and proposals submitted to the Cabinet, but it is not consistently applied across the federal government. In other words, GBA exists in theory, but not so much in practice. Provincially and territorially, some form of GBA policies and practices exist within the governments of BC, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, Ontario, PEI, and Quebec. The extent to which these policies and practices are applied varies greatly by region, department, and in what form the GBA takes. GBA is not required in Alberta, Nova Scotia, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Saskatchewan, or Yukon. Although not officially mandated, it's worth noting that most of these provinces and territories have some policies requiring gender and diversity analysis, but these policies remain largely unimplemented and vary greatly from department to department. A very interesting and promising tool involving GBA was developed in 2012 by a group of women from Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador. They began work with researchers to create the Community Vitality Index, a tool to identify and monitor changes to the well-being of women within the community. This was largely prompted by concerns about the Lower Churchill Hydroelectric Dam project and its impact on the community, and on women in particular. Due to the fact that Newfoundland and Labrador was not tracking potential impacts that were identified by the Joint Review Panel, including increased substance abuse, sexual assault, family violence, and other effects on women and children, the team took on the task of identifying and tracking these impacts. The index measures well-being in 5 areas: mental, cultural, emotional, spiritual, and physical. The CVI was successfully piloted in Happy Bay, Goose Valley in 2013. Since its finalization in 2014, the CVI has been brought to the Nunavut Community Council in Labrador and Tamatik Status of Women and the Haisla Nation in Kitimat and Haisla, BC. With each new location, local advisory groups and diverse groups of women work to customize the index to the priorities and definitions of wellness of each individual community. This tool shows promise as a way for communities to create their own standards at the grassroots level and ensure that gendered impacts are not ignored. The requirement to include gender-based analysis in environmental assessment processes and in all government policies, programs, and initiatives should not be optional. The absence of mandatory requirements is arguably the biggest barrier to GBA being implemented. All levels of government should work to weave GBA into environmental assessment as a key strategy to mitigate the adverse effects and maximize the long-term benefits of resource development for diverse populations. When used correctly, GBA can be an integral tool to ensure that women, Indigenous peoples, and our community's most vulnerable populations are given space, are heard, and can affect change to improve their own futures. Over the past few days, we've heard a multitude of stories of sorrow and tragedy, yet I also see a wealth of strength, resilience, and a massive drive for change. Working together, I believe we can turn devastation into inspiration.
But not very much apart. And he's mostly, I was there. But
Sorry, we had a last minute huddle over there. So we just wanted to thank Senator and her team for coming to share their words of wisdom with us. And James will take you out on the suggestion that we could move forward together. And I see Doris Young here. I saw her in the back. Doris, are you here? There you are. And I just want to thank Doris. Doris was actually the one that had put us in touch with Senator when we were in Ottawa. It was totally serendipitous, and I think we were meant to meet on this path. And Doris helped make this happen. So thank you, Doris, for that. And these are, you know, you can't see our invisible bags. This is for James and for Anna. And thank you so much. So we're going to take a little bit of a break and come back. We'll announce, this is a TBA moment. So we're going to take a little break and reconvene 11:30? 11:30, okay. Enjoy your coffee.